All right, we're off. So today we're going to be talking about forms, controlled forms. We'll explain a little bit more about what that word means, controlled. Um, if you recall last time, let me see, do I have the app running? Whoops, sorry. Get rid of some stuff here, my bad. Do you have the app running? Let's try to get on the right port here. I think it's on 3001. Nope. Try that again. So where we left off last time, we had basically wired things up so we're keeping track of the count of our GIFs. We tied that value to state in a way that allowed multiple components. If we look at our hierarchy, we have the GIF count receiving some data from app state. We also have the GIF list and the GIF component receiving data from state. And then when we delete a GIF down here, when we go ahead and click, right? If we click like this, we're updating state and we're allowing our component, we've got the architecture right, so our GIF count can update based on the same state that our GIF component is modifying. And so what we're going to do today, we're going to add in a form so that we can post new, so that any of you actually can post new GIFs to the API, and it'll be cool because we can see everyone's GIFs reflected when we all post stuff. I think I mentioned at the end of last time that I wanted to talk more about the hierarchy and the architecture. I've decided actually to push that until after we do forms, since we're already working with events last time, and events tie in, of course, to form submission and stuff like that. I figure we'll kind of get the app fully working, if you will, for this series, and then we can have a more intelligent conversation about state and architecture and why state needs to live in certain places. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit. So our objectives for today, implement a controlled form. And for a form to be controlled in React properly, we need to bind input values to state, and we need to handle changes to our inputs so that we're modifying state essentially on every character press. We'll talk about a little bit more about why that's important. And then if we get to it, this may end up being sort of a two-parter on forms. If we get to it, we'll work on handling the actual form submission to do two things basically. I'm gonna modify these objectives to have data persistence. So that would be making a call to a backend, right? Sending out a post request, and then also modifying state on the front end so that our user interface, that our single page app can update really quickly. And so then we get kind of the whole piece of the puzzle. Or the whole puzzle, I suppose. We get data persistence on the back end, and we get a really quick, clean update on the front end. Any questions on objectives before we jump in? All right, cool. Oh, we've got notes here. Let's get rid of those notes for right now. We'll take some notes together. Sweet. So, resources. So what I'd like you to do actually to start is open up this link on forms. These are again coming from the React docs. If you haven't noticed yet, I've had a lot of links to the React documentation because it's actually pretty well written and pretty helpful. So forms, as they say right up at the top here, they work differently in React and we need to handle them differently. So I guess with a lot of things in React, we're kind of making a paradigm shift in our thinking, and we're going to make a little bit of an adjustment in how we approach forms as well. So what I'd like you to do is read this section on forms, focus on this controlled components thing, and you can check out some of the code samples. They've got the areas of most import highlighted here. And you don't have to worry about this text area tag and select tag and stuff like that. You can read more about that stuff on your own. But read that first section, and I've also thrown a link in to this section on handling multiple inputs. You can read that if you want. We will be talking about how to do that today. So the most important part is this first section on forms. So I'm going to do a 3-minute timer to read and to check out the code snippets, and then we can have some group discussion on what's the deal with forms in React. as you're reading and checking out the snippets, try to have in mind what this word controlled is and like what it means in the context of React forms and why we would potentially want our forms to be controlled in this way. About another minute left for reading and for personal thought. Last 10 seconds or so. All right, I'm gonna stop this so it doesn't beep. Beeped a little bit, but that's okay. All right, cool. Let's do 2 minutes, do a turn and talk with the person next to you or the people at your table and discuss what the heck does a controlled form mean or what is different about how we handle forms in React versus what we're used to in sort of like vanilla JS, if you will. 2 minutes.
Oh yeah, so not just
About another 30 seconds. All right, start wrapping up your conversations and we'll chat all together. Stop this, no beep. All right, cool. I heard some good stuff. Let's come to some consensus together on what the heck a controlled form means, why we care about it, and kind of how it works in React. So let's take some volunteers. What actually let's say like what is a controlled form? So who's got a thought? on what controlled means, on anything that you just read, code that you looked at, code that you've written perhaps. Yeah, Michael.
Control form state controls the value that you see as opposed to what the user's typing.
Let's say state controls the value you see. I'm going to hold back a little bit on opposed to what the user is typing because it does have to do with what the user is typing. But I see where you're going with that for sure. So state controls the value you see. Yeah, very nice. Who wants to add something? Could be what is a controlled form, and let's add / why bother controlling form values. Yeah, Matt.
One example would be if you have a specific user logged in. That user's data, or like you could, every time they key-click, that data would be set to the state so that if they navigated away from the page, the data would be saved so that if they navigate back to that page, the form data would still be populated in there. You wouldn't have to type a form. If they're on a form, then you have to type. The developers are set the state.
Nice. Yeah, really, really nice. We're essentially saving the form data so that it's not the only reason why, but a big reason is for usability, right? We've all probably had the experience at this point with filling out a form on a website and you either don't fill something out right or you click submit before you were ready and the form was incomplete and then the form resets. And if it's a big long form, you want to blow your brains out. Especially if you're, for me, like filling it out on a phone, I suck at touch typing. So if I lose form data like that, I'm like, screw it, I'm not signing up for this thing. So controlling these input values on state allows us to provide a better user experience. User can leave page, come back, and form data is available. Form can be submitted incorrectly, let's say, and not reset. Essentially just provides good UX. And since forms are such a big part of interactive applications, you know, signing up for things, submitting things, editing things, etc., like getting that CRUD functionality, create, read, update, delete, that'll mean more when you get into backend stuff. But forms are a huge part of apps, and so we want to handle our forms as best we can. And since front-end frameworks are sort of the latest and greatest way of doing user interfaces, part of the idea is to provide a good user experience. So controlled forms really help us a lot with that. That's a nice list here. I think that we should dive into actually writing one, and then we can see a little bit more. We can implement some of the code samples they have here basically in the context of our app. We can talk about it a little bit more. So the first thing we need to do, I think ultimately what I want, if we look at our app, I think let's replace these paragraphs, this section, with a form. So first step, what should we do? What should our first step be if we want to make a form and get it on the page?
Form file.
Yeah, make a new file, make a form component. So, no, that's good. Multiple people, that's good consensus. You guys are right. So let's go to our components folder and let's create a component called gifform.js. Now, I think they mentioned in the docs here, we're essentially now introducing a little bit more complexity into our app in the sense that we are actually now going to have another stateful component. And this is part of why I wanted to get this second state in there, if you will, before we have our conversation about state as a whole, because we'll have more to work with when we talk about it. So let's check our hierarchy. We're going to add another component in here. Whoops, I'll just copy one of these. And we'll move the header over. We'll move the GIF count over because I want to put it like right in between them. And we'll paste this in. And this is GIF form. And let's see if I can properly tie it because I've failed at that many times. All right, sweet. There we go. So GIF form, and GIF form is going to have state as well. So I'm going to pull another state thing over here. See if we can connect those. Cool. And we'll talk a lot more actually about why it's having state and how or if that affects the rest of the application. But for right now, let's implement it. So it's going to be a class component. So let's start out. We'll import. Whoops. we'll import React and the React.component. So we're just destructuring to get the component from the React library. That's all we really need at the start. And then class GIF form extends component. And it's a class, so we need to open up some braces. It's essentially an object. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare some state on this form. Not even going to put anything in it yet, but the whole reason why we're making this a class component is so it can have state and so it can have some methods to handle changes to the form itself. So we probably don't need a component did mount because this form is kind of going to be its own self-contained thing within the app. And that plays into why it's okay, if you will, for this form to have its own state. But we're going to need a render function. So let's create one of those, and it's going to need to return something. It's probably going to be multiple lines, so we'll use the parentheses and create a block. And for right now, let's just create like an I'm going to enable my React IntelliSense. We'll do an H3 that just says hello from form. Or maybe, you know what? Let's just make it say submit a GIF. So right now it's not doing much, but we should be able to get it onto the page and see this H3. That'll be the start of our form. So if we go back to app.js now, if we want to get this form on the page, what do we need to do? Import. Very nice. We'll go up to our list of imported components, copy our previous, and this will be GIF form. Actually, I've forgotten something very important. Yes, export. Nailed it. Cool. So we'll do export default GIF form. I have a bad habit of forgetting that piece. Cool. And we'll go back to app.js. Now we have it imported. We can go down to our render. And as I said, let's just get rid of the paragraphs because that was more for fun to play around with mapping. And we'll pull in GIF form. Right now it's not receiving any props, so we can just render it. And let's go back to our app and see what we get. Hard refresh. Cool. Data's loading, data loaded, and we just have a little submitted GIF here. Nice, good start. So now let's construct a form within here. Yeah, we'll leave the H3 there. We'll declare a form component. We don't need an action on it because we're going to handle whether it's posting, getting, we're going to handle the post with JavaScript. So we don't need an action on there. And we're going to need 2 inputs. The reason for that is although we're only displaying the image URL of the GIF, they all have a description as well. So we'll have one input for the URL, one input for the description. And so let's do a couple inputs here. Yep, type text sounds good. And I'm going to give it an ID as well so that we can label it properly. We'll just do GIF URL as the ID, and then we can do a label. And you notice typically labels are just for, label for, and then the name of the ID it's a label for. Kind of like class name versus just class. For is, of course, a word in JavaScript, a reserved keyword. So we have HTML for. And your IntelliSense, if you're using VS Code, will automatically populate that for you. And it's a label for the GIF URL. So the way labels work, we need to match up the for and the ID. And we'll just say GIF URL. And we can basically copy this to create our second input and modify it a little bit. So I'll make a little space just so it's easier to read. This will be HTML for GIF-description, let's say. And we'll just change this to be GIF. Oops. Description. Cool. So let's go back to our app. Oh, yeah. Let's just put our H3 inside. So React is yelling at us for not having all of our elements wrapped in one tag. Doesn't know how to handle that. So ultimately, the H3 does not need to be outside the form. So we can just put the H3 in here, and then the form will be the containing element. So that should do the trick. Cool. It's kind of an ugly form right now, but that's okay. We can add some styling to it, perhaps. functioning. Right now, we can input. We don't actually. We need a submit button, right? So let's do a button. We'll do type submit, and we'll say submit GIF right here. So now if we go back, we have our little button. Right now, it just submits, it refreshes the page, right? That's the default action, so we'll need to prevent that. But our form is on the page, so this is a good start. Now, if we check the documentation here, they show us this example of having this handle change event and tying values to state. So this is the controlled part of handling forms. So what we're essentially doing is we're going to create this feedback loop where our form has elements, it has inputs that have values, right? That's what gets populated when someone types something in to our input form, or to our actual inputs. And what we're going to do, we've made this a stateful component so that when someone inputs, we will actually modify state every time a character is input. So every time that input changes, we'll use the onChange event. And so we tie changes to state, and then we tie state to the value of the inputs itself. So we create this kind of like circular feedback loop or circuitry where every character change, state's being updated, and the value is being set, and then the value is being, kind of as Michael was alluding to earlier, the value is sort of being populated from state. So it's a multi-step process, and let's run through it together. The first, well, and as you see right now in the app, we have nothing bound, so we can type in as you would expect. Now, let's add values to these. And in fact, I'm going to break these out for readability. So we're going to add a value to both of them. And the value is got to be a property on state. So we'll do value equals this dot state dot, and then we want to mirror the way the data looks coming from the API, because we're going to control this, like state's just an object, right? So we're going to set up our state object to mirror exactly the type of data that the API needs to receive. And so if you recall, the data came as an array of objects. Each object had a GIF URL, camel cased, and then had a description. So we'll take care of the first input. Let's make a little space here too. Make these a little more readable, and we need a value here too. And so this will be this dot state dot description. Right now, app's probably, oh, it didn't break actually. So even though we don't have state explicitly set, looks like it's just rendering, tying to nothing right here. So what we really want though is we want to have some initial state. So let's go ahead and do GIF URL. We'll set that as an empty string to start because we want the input fields to be empty. And then we'll do description, description here, set that to an empty string too. So this looks pretty good in terms of the wiring so far. But now that we've bound, so you can't probably tell, but I'm typing. You know, I'm trying to type stuff in to these inputs. Now we've bound the value to state. And if we look at state, state is, for both inputs, is an empty string. So since it's bound, it can only be an empty string right now. And that's what's preventing us from being able to input anything. So the way so we've created one part of this loop, right? We've tied the input values to state. We've kind of saying, hey, render the value from state. We need to make the other part of the loop so that we can actually input something into the form. So they show you in the docs actually this handle change method. So we're going to write a handle change method. We'll write a handle submit method. This one is a little bit more simplified. We're going to need to do a little more work than they're doing here. We're going to do something very similar to the code that they have in that section that I linked on, wait, where is it? handling multiple inputs here. So if you want to check out how they do it in the docs, you can. We're going to do a similar thing here. So we don't want to have to write a separate method for each input, right? Because then we're repeating ourselves quite a bit. So it is possible to write a fairly, like a generic and thus more widely usable handle submit function. So let's go ahead and I'll write handle submit equals a fat arrow function. And again, we need to bind this either using fat arrow syntax or in the constructor, because this method is going to actually be changing state. So we need to tell it what context to change state in. We want it to change the state of this particular class, so we bind it to this class. And I'm going to declare the event in here because since we're going to tie it to we're essentially making this an event handler, so it will implicitly be able to capture the event. And I'm just going to log working for right now. So next step, we have a basic handle submit method. It's not doing anything yet really, but we can verify that it's working. So let's attach it to our inputs. So just like we were able to use onClick yesterday, we can do onChange. So every time a character is entered or deleted into this input, this method will fire. And we'll open up our curlies, and we need to reference the class and then the method name. So we'll do this dot. I wrote handle submit, but I actually want this to be a handle change function. That's my bad. Handle change. And we want to do the same exact thing on the other input. And that's the benefit of writing this generically. We could apply this logic to any inputs on the page, essentially. And so we'll just add this line in here. So both inputs now have an onChange method. We're not going to be able to actually change yet, but if we go back to our app and we open up the DevTools, we should see a console log. Actually, maybe we won't see it because we... Oh, there we go. So we're typing, we're trying to change things. We're not seeing a value actually change, but we are seeing our console log. So far, so good with the wiring. Nice. Now, let's make this handle change method actually work. So the way I like to write this is I declare two constants. Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to be able to set state, identify the right key, and the right value. So we need this to be able to handle changes to GIF URL and description inputs. So the first thing I do is I declare a constant called key. Since we're setting key value pairs for state, it's just an object, key value pairs. We do const key equals event.target.name. Now we don't have a name attribute yet. We'll add that. But that's going to be what goes on the left side, right? That's going to be the left side of the object we set state with. And then we'll do const value equals event.target.value. And this is part of why we need the event declared here. So before we even set state, let's add this name attribute because this is crucial. So I'm going to do it right below the value, and we'll do name equals, actually just a string in this case, and we need to line the name up with the property on state that we want to set. So we'll do name equals, for this one, description. And for this one, we'll do it in the same line as the other. We'll do name equals GIF URL camel cased. Cool. So now we should be capturing the name and the value from the input. And we can now call our set state function. Open those parentheses, pass it an object, and now we can pump in using bracket notation. Because if we were just to write key like this, it would be key the string. But when we wrap it in bracket notation, it allows key the variable to resolve into the event.target's name and set that as essentially the string for key. And then we pump in value like that. And now, for any input that has a name and a value, this should work. This should update our state. So let's go back to our app. We should be able to type stuff now. Let's see. Yeah, sweet. Now we can type some characters in. Computer's struggling a little bit. And I want to show you, actually, I want to show you two things. First, this is the way, if you want to console log state, remember I mentioned that it's asynchronous, so if you log this dot state right behind here, or right below, you may not see the latest version of state. There's a relatively easy fix if you want to see the most updated version right after setting state, and we can make set state a higher order function. So it can take an optional second argument that is itself a function, so we'll declare a fat arrow function, and we'll console log this dot state in that little function. So it will set state, and then this is a callback function once it's been set. So now if we go back to our app, we've got a couple warnings. We'll clean those up before we finish the app. Now, you see each time you type something in, the GIF URL is being set, and then as we start typing in description, GIF URL and description are being set after every single key press. So this seems like a lot of functions firing, and I suppose it is, but this lets us keep track of every character our users entered so we can provide that clean user experience in certain cases. I just threw a good amount at you. I want to touch base and see how people are feeling about this binding that we've done, this feedback loop that we've created from the form as it triggers an on-change event to state, and then from state back to the value of the form. Does anyone have questions on any part of what we just touched on? That feedback loop, the value, the name? So I call the variables key and value because an object is a key value pair. And we need some way to uniquely identify the input that has just been changed. So if we give it a name attribute, then we can use this. So this string, when a change event happens when a change event happens, this string becomes the key, and then the value becomes the value pulled from, So in the case of an on-change event on GIF URL, GIF URL becomes the key because it's the event target's name. And then in the case of a change to description, the description input, this is the event.target.name. And so this becomes the key, and the input's value becomes the value. So we essentially are just writing this function in as sort of like a generic way so that it can be used on 1 input, 2 inputs, 20 inputs, rather than having to write a method for every input, which would be not dry coding practices. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I kind of like the generic good handler, but if you were to validate these different types, would you like have a switch in the one good handler, or would that be a case of having multiple?
It's a great question. Michael's asking about if you wanted to validate the inputs, would you want to keep it in one function? What I would probably do, you could and just account for the different types of inputs that are coming in and find some other way to identify them, like perhaps by their ID. You could also, what I would probably do is write some helper functions like validate description input, validate URL input, and call both of those within within handle change. But there are a lot of different ways you could approach that. But I'd probably do it with some helper functions. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Because this is probably the most confusing and also the most crucial part of controlling your forms.
Michael, what was the reason for I guess I'm confused on why you do that.
Validate?
Yeah, like validate for the user's input.
Yeah, just to make sure that they're inputting the right kind of stuff. Like in the case of the URL, you could validate to see if it has HTTP in it and .com in it. I guess it wouldn't have to be .com. So you may run into some situations where you do need to have some specific handle change methods for certain inputs, but you can get away with this for a lot of applications. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? All right, cool. We'll move on for right now. going to change this back to key so that it still works. Get rid of that. And let's go back to the app and make sure I haven't broken anything when I was playing around with stuff. Come on. All right, cool. It's working. Excellent. So we now have our form properly controlled. Let's go back to our README here. We've bound the input values to state. We've created a handle change method that is generic enough to work for many different inputs. Our next objective is to handle form submission. And let's break this into multiple sort of sub-objectives here. So handle form submission, and our two goals there are have data persistence, so that's sending a request to the back end, and then to modify state on front end. So we may not get to both of those today, but at the very least we can work on our first one. So what I would like to do now is we need to, whoops, I'm in the wrong component here. Ah, what happened to my form? There we go. So we're controlling this form properly. We have an object on state, our state object is basically exactly what we want to send in a post request because we formatted it in that way. So what I want to challenge you to do now is let's all declare a handle submit function, and let's bind it as well. I just bind all my functions out of habit. Sometimes you don't necessarily have to if you don't need it to control state, but it's just a habit, and I would encourage you to do it as well because there's very little downside to not binding them. So we'll handle submit, and right now I'm not sure it needs to actually take anything in as an argument or as a parameter. So we'll leave that empty for right now. And your task is to construct a post request using fetch. And we can grab the URL that we need right from app.js. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this whole line and pull it into the form and just declare it as a constant right up at the top near the input. So this is the API URL. This is the endpoint /gifs that you need to send the post request to. And ultimately, basically just you need to construct a post request. So keep in mind the URL is above, and also with a post you need an options, let's say second argument is an options object, right? So that's where you can specify the content type, stuff like that. Actually, let's talk about it. What are the things that we need in our options hash, the object that we pass to let fetch know we're doing something different than a GET request? Method post. Whoops, I'll just do it like that. Method post. I'm kind of shorthanding this. You may need to write it slightly differently. So method post. What else do we need? So that's what this whole thing I'm calling the options object. So we need the method. There's a couple more things that we need. Header, yeah, headers. And what's the last thing that every post request needs? The body, right? We're sending data, so we need a body. So again, this is shorthand. That's not exact syntax of how to construct this, but what I want to do is give you all 5 minutes to see if you can write this method. And then we can modify it together as needed, and we'll attach it into our form so we can actually send stuff to the back end. I will say, if you get it done and you want to start working with it, you can attach it to the actual form itself. And let's go ahead. This is going to need to take in the event because we want to prevent that default action, right? So we'll add that, prevent default action. So I'm going to leave these up as like notes so you can reference the things you need to do. In fact, we'll zoom it in a little bit more. And I'm going to open up. You guys think 5 minutes is good? 7, 10? Let's do 6. We'll split the difference. Yeah, and we'll go over it together as well. And if you're having issues as you're working, raise your hand, and I'll be coming around. Actually, I'm gonna go get my charger. I'm running low on battery, but then I'll be around. Cool. So this is what you're working on right here. Oh yeah, sure. Like, feel free to work together on this too. Yeah. So that's okay. So what you need to do is because the test will just check whatever's involved. So you go to it's the start script. You just port yeah, all caps equals that'll set it to 3,000. Got about another minute or so to work on the code. Another 30 seconds or so to work on the code. All right, last couple seconds. I'm going to stop this timer. Oh, okay, one beep. That's all right. We'll live. Cool. I heard some. I saw some good stuff. I heard some good like pair programming and discussion. So let's come together now and let's write this baby together. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So I want to just kind of go around the tables here. So this table right here, help me out. Let's write this together. What's the first thing I need to do?
Well, the first thing I did was jump down the form and it was on submit.
Nice. All right, I love it. So on our form element in our return, we'll capture the onSubmit event. We'll bring in our React curlies, and we'll call this dot handle submit. Very nice. Someone from this table, help me out. Next piece. Okay. Cool. So we'll do fetch API URL. There it is. Comma. Cool. So we'll start up our options hash or our options object. Actually, I'm just going to move all this down below the notes. Cool. And we'll bring it back in line here. So, all right. Someone from the back table. What do we need in our options object here? What's one thing that we need? We talked about some of it up here. Yeah, post method. So we'll do method, and then we need a string, and all caps post. All right, next thing. We need headers. Someone from this table. I know you guys are just two, but.
Create an object, so you do headers, and then colon, and create an object.
Nice.
Inside of that, we set string as a content type.
Nice. Content dash type.
Yeah, creating two values, and then
Yep.
application/JSON.
Whoops. Application/JSON. So this is letting the backend know what type of content we're sending. Very important. Cool. What else? Someone from this table. Yeah, body. So we'll declare our body key. And then here's a big question. What is the body of this post? It's the entire state. Yes. Very, very nice, right? This is why we've gone to, well, maybe not great lengths, but we've intentionally set state up so that it mirrors the data format, right? The keys are the same type of keys that our API is expecting. The values are whatever their values are, but we can just pass this whole state object. Yes, question?
Do we need to add an ID to state?
So yeah, great question. Do we need to add an ID to state? We don't. I love where your head's at. Your head is in absolutely the right place, but since this is like a full stack app basically, what we can do, we just need to tell the server, hey, here's this new stuff that I want you to store, and then the server will respond. If it's been set up right, and I made this API, so I set it up right, the server will actually respond with the newly posted thing, and that will include the ID in it. But yeah, because we do need that ID to iterate, right? We're using it as the key in our maps. We're using it as the identifier for our delete. So it's really crucial. But the API itself will provide that for us. So as Eldon was saying, the body is this dot state. However, that's not going to do the trick quite, right? JSON.stringify. Yes, JSON.stringify. Because we just told the server we're sending JSON, so we need to make sure we actually do that. I think this looks good. It looks good to me.
Question.
Yeah, question.
We would just have to read the API documentation to know that it handles ID creation.
Yeah, I mean, really any API is gonna generate IDs for you. If you, because that's an impossible thing for a front end to know, is like what's the next ID in the sequence. So any API worth its salt, which is like any API that's made it public in any way, I would say, is going to, it may not respond with exactly the format that you want, but it will, you will not need to send an ID over in 99% of cases. But yeah, that's a really good question and really good thought process. Yeah.
So I know you said when you're moving on from listing to prevent default on that.
Yes. Thank you. We need to prevent the default action. So prevent default, right? Because we want to control the form action with our JavaScript. Nice. Excellent. This looks really good. I'm going to delete our comments there. And so we're going to make the request. So then we need to capture the response. So .then response, we'll do our fat arrow to return response.json, right? So we can just make this response intelligible. So in another .then, I'm going to call this post now because the API is set up, as I mentioned, and you wouldn't necessarily know this, but the API is set up when a post succeeds, or if it fails, it sends back an object with some information. If it succeeds, it sends back an object with that newly created thing. For right now, we're going to need to do more work in here, but for right now, I'm just going to console log the post so we can see what happens, basically. Looks pretty good to me. Let's get back to our app and see if it works. And do a hard refresh, make sure it has the latest stuff. And I'm just going to type in some gibberish right now. And, ooh. So we're seeing state logging still. I'm going to remove that log because it's going to clutter our console up. But let's see what happens when we submit. Okay. We did get a response. The post failed. But we got some information about why. We get an error, invalid input. And Michael, you were talking about validation, right? So we don't have any front-end validation, but we do have some, the server itself has some validation. So it's letting us know we have invalid input and the message, the GIF URL must be a valid URI. So I pumped in a bunch of gibberish. The API is saying, hey, we're not going to accept that. You need to actually send a legitimate URL. I will tell you also, if you have a valid URL, but you have a description that's less than 3 characters, you're going to get an error back as well. URI, URL, they're splitting hairs here. Come on. But yeah, it needs to be a valid URI. So, and as I said, I was playing with this earlier. So if you submit a valid URI, let's clear this out, but you don't have a description, you're also going to get an error. Description is not allowed to be empty. If we have 2 characters, we'll get description length must be at least 3 characters. So we have some basic validation. It's happening on the back end, and the back end is responding and telling us if we've made a mistake. It's best practice to have validation on front and back end. Back end is even a little more important because people could get at your API from other ways than your app. Ultimately, though, we are getting information, right? Our app isn't crashing. And if we wanted to make this a more complete app, we could display that error on the page, right? And let the user know what they've made a mistake on. But let's modify it again now, and let's give it a legit description of legit description. And let's see what happens when we submit now. So, looks like it succeeded. We get a response with, so here's what I was talking about. We get our response, or our post, as we're logging it right here, is an object. It has a key of created. So this is the full object of what was just created and put in the database. So we have the URL, we have the description, and now we have the ID, which of course we need for our application to function. So we're probably not going to have enough time to implement updates to our state on the front end as well as this back end persistence. But if we refresh now, we see our number of GIFs is now 13 because we've added some stuff to the database. We've actually posted some new stuff. This guy right here, I think. Oh, and other people have posted stuff too. Hell yes, awesome. This is why I wanted to do it with like a live API so we can all see the things that got posted in. Excellent, so our counter is working. We have data persistence. We don't yet have that super slick, I click post, it succeeds and I immediately get a change to my state as well. This is part of the complexity of front-end frameworks is if we look back at our objectives here, we have data persistence, so we can check that box. Now we need to modify state on the front end. So we're going to close here for the day. But I will say, if you want to work on this on your own, we'll pick it up, I guess not tomorrow, but Thursday. But if you want to work on it on your own, this is going to be your place to shine. So this is where we have access to that new resource that's been created. This is where, because this is asynchronous code, this block is where you can work on getting state updated, which is going to involve somehow getting this information of the newly posted thing back up the hierarchy, right? Because we've fired this method down here, and it's bound down here. It's bound to this state. So we need to work on getting the new resource back up to app level state. We'll cover that next time. Before we close, can I get a quick fist to 5 on how confident you feel about controlling forms and submitting data? All right, cool. Definitely come with questions for next time or anything that you'd like clarification on, because I want to do a recap of what we did today, and then we'll get that data updating on the front end as well. All right, awesome. Thanks so much. Oh, yeah, Michael, question.
Would we want to set a delete method
So, yeah, so Michael's asking, should we make the delete persistent as well? Yes, ideally yes. Of course, normally you would, but I think in the interest of not having everything deleted from the API, maybe hold off on that. I will say, if you want to play with it, there is a delete route. So if you want to play around with that, that's cool. If everything disappears, I can just reseed again. It's not a big deal. So yeah, that's some good, like, quote unquote homework also. See if you can get the delete method that we wrote. Where is that? This actually, it's on app. So see if you can get this delete GIF method to be data persistent as well by sending out a fetch request. Yeah, awesome. All right, sweet. Thanks so much for your time. We'll pick it up next time.